All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second and final panel session of today's half-day forum. My name is Michelle, and I am a board member of Women in Data, and I'll be moderating this session. And so this session or this panel is going to be on democratizing open science and responsible AI. I know this is a hot topic. We've been covering a lot of different angles today, whether that's industry adoption or kind of just the general policy landscape and how we can start to think about open science in this context. And in this session, I really want us to focus on how data, AI, and policy come together to really drive innovation, kind of like some of these more complex challenges that we're facing, and what we can do to frame this in our mind regarding transparency and accountability. And so with that, I'm going to let our esteemed panelists introduce themselves. So starting with Sunil, if you can provide a little bit of background on yourself, kind of like your journey here, and as well as what you're working on these days.
Thank you, Michelle, for the invitation to speak today. Really kind offer, and it's great to get out and just kind of share my ideas as well as learn from all of you. So I'll share that up front. I started my career actually as a lawyer in the government. I was fortunate to have a front row seat to the growth of broadband networks as a lawyer at the FCC. So that was kind of my starting point into technology. After 3 years there, I quickly wanted to jump into the Web 1 craziness and moved to California and joined Yahoo. I spent 2 years there at Yahoo working on like voice over IP. Then I moved over to Google, where I spent about 6 years there, all launching various new products like Google Wallet, Google Voice, Google Fiber, AdSense. And then went over to Uber to launch Uber Eats, as well as Uber Rush, some of their new products. So even though I'm much looks apparently older than I look and act, I've been through a lot of different platform shifts and changes, and worked in different companies and different products. But the common denominator is taking new technologies, taking new services to mass market. So that's what I'm, very excited about our topics today, AI, and a lot to learn from this panel myself. And currently, I have an AI company called Sift AI. It helps companies manage public and private communities, understanding what's conversations happening in their communities and taking action against it. Also, I'm lucky to participate in Women in Data Ethics Committee, and I'm trying to do a little more writing and hopefully publish more of my thoughts to, just to kind of see what's happening, because I've noticed similar trends that happened in my prior experiences in technology, whether it be from dial-up to broadband to PC to mobile. These tectonic shifts, there's certain similarities I'm seeing now happening in AI, which are both exciting and also concerning, but it's a great topic to have. So thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Sunil. Robin, how about you? How was your journey and what are you working on these days?
Yeah, so again as well. Thank you very much, Michelle and team, for the opportunity. Really looking forward to being here. So Robin Sutara, I'm currently a field CDO with Databricks. What that means is that I get to travel around the world and help organizations that are using the Databricks platform, which is based on open technologies, be successful with their data and AI. And typically that requires not just technology, but also people, process, organizational design, change management, all of the strategic sort of functions that you need to underline the supporting technology. My career actually started a little more eclectic. I started in the US Army doing weapons and electrical systems on the Apache helicopters, which I love to say my career has now gone Apache to Apache, and we'll sort of make that resonate. I did that for several years and worked with this great product called Excel. Started creating databases on aircraft maintenance records and realized I wanted to go work at Microsoft as a result and sort of see what that would happen there. I got out of the Army and spent 23 years at Microsoft and various sort of functions. Started out there similar to Sunil, sort of all these shifts in technology. So I started supporting IE5 on Windows 3.1, graduated up through multiple product platforms, ultimately holding roles like Chief Operating Officer for Azure Data Engineering, as well as Chief Data Officer for Microsoft UK before I left for Databricks in 2022. So yeah, super excited to be here and share a little bit of that perspective. I by education am a lawyer, never practiced like like Sunil. So very opinionated, and I think it's a phenomenal space right now when we sort of see what's going on around AI, ethics, responsible AI, transparency, explainability, etc. So really looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you so much. I love the Apache to Apache tagline. It should be your LinkedIn tagline, but wonderful. And last but not least, Fatma, how about you? What is your background and what are you working on these days?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this great panel. I'm very excited to have this discussion with you all. I'm Fatma Tarlaci. I'm currently the CTO at Restagar Capital. We are a commercial real estate investment company. And I have been in the space of AI, ML, and data science for about a decade now. And I have worked in different shapes and forms in academia and research space in AI in the industry until I transitioned into like a full engineering roles, including data scientists and ML engineering and all that. So currently I'm working of, we have very recently created a technology program at the engineering department in our company, which is not very common in real estate investment companies before, but we have seen a lot of use cases about how we can utilize AI and data and bring it into our space. And that entails things like, especially in a field like ours, which is highly regulated, about compliance and how do we regulate and use the data that is both open and private. So those are some of the things that we are focusing on currently and trying to integrate AI in use cases that are applicable. And unfortunately, not all of them are. And there are a lot of, as you also know, hype and buzz around AI as well. But yeah, that's what we're trying to do right now.
Yeah, thank you so much. And as everyone can see, we have a very diverse group of perspectives here. And so, and please feel free to, of course, post your questions in the chat, and we'll be trying to incorporate your questions and comments in the discussion. So to start things off, maybe, the title of this panel is Open Science and Responsible AI and Democratizing that. But given your backgrounds, maybe we can start with, what does democratizing AI mean to you? Especially we've talked a bit about open in general, but yeah, give us some of your thoughts on what democratizing AI means in your expertise and context. And maybe Sunil, I can start with you, and feel free to jump in on any of the speakers' comments.
Just trying to unmute myself. I'm glad you're bringing up the definitional things. I think oftentimes people use terms without really understanding what their starting point is. And I think so many cocktail room debates can be addressed by first asking them to define what they're arguing about. That addresses it, so what their assumptions are. My definition of democratizing in this context is bringing the benefits of new innovation services to the masses, to other people. That distribution doesn't always happen all the time. It doesn't happen right away to everyone. There's always a sequencing in which that happens. I think part of how the adoption of new technology and services is unequal. It just normally is. And I think there's a role for companies and the government and policymakers and academics to inform that debate. But ultimately, it's like, things that, if you look at the quality of life and what we could do here today compared to what the aristocrats lived 50, even 100 years ago, it's remarkable. So continue on that thing. But even then, there is always a fear that the injustices or inequalities of the world are further exacerbated by technology, not advanced by it. So that term is very popular. Almost every startup pitch deck has democratization or some variation or synonym related to it in their pitch deck, which is a powerful tool, especially in the consumer side, even in the enterprise side. So my view in particular is, how do you take the benefits of innovation and technology and services and bringing it to a broader group of people who perhaps wouldn't even know this exists, didn't understand what even AI means. If this works for them, it makes their lives better. So that's how I kind of view it. Now, when it comes to that definition in and of itself is also very contextualized. Even in the source of even open source software, open source LLMs, what we're building here in the US is very different. We're building in Europe, very different. We're building in China. I think you can't ignore that even word democratization can be a very sensitive topic to many of these people. In Europe, for example, their history leads to very different concerns of privacy, and that's a very adamant principle that they have. In the case of China, their definition of free speech is very different than ours, especially political speech. So you have to take into context in which some of these conversations are happening, and you can't ignore the national interests involved in where some of these models are being built. So even though they may share a common kernel or thread of open sourceness, ultimately you cannot ignore the context in which they're being built. So it's important to these terms, whether it be responsible or democratization, is very contextualized and important for us to consider as we start these conversations.
I would say, I would even take that one step forward. Like, absolutely agree with the regional, social, economic sort of impact and definition might vary depending on, location. But I see even within organizations, it differs depending on persona, right? Like we talk about democratization of data and democratization of AI, but how I democratize data to a business user is very different than how I would democratize data or data platforms or technologies to a data engineer or a data scientist, right? It's just because their capabilities and competencies and where they're starting from are very, very different. I remember when ChatGPT first came out, my grandmother is calling me saying, how do I use this? And I think the really interesting realization is that now meant that every company using ChatGPT had the same competitive advantage as my grandmother. You're all using the same sort of availability and accessibility to the same technology and the same platform. And so when you think about democratization and the things that you're trying to drive as an organization and your mission and your values and all those things that you're trying to execute, how do you make sure that you've defined democratization for the organization for the right personas to achieve those goals and objectives?
Yeah, I certainly agree with Sunil and Robin. And just to add to that, I think it's also important to look at the education behind how we are going to democratize AI and data science or open science. Is like if you make all the models and data available, unless everybody has the equal or comparable ways of accessing that data, it's really not going to be helpful, right? Like, or if they don't know how to use that data or those models and how to apply them. If I don't have a stable internet connection, it doesn't matter that you have all the tools open available to everybody out there. So I think starting with education and looking at the context of company, starting from an organization, like Robin said, or starting from a state or a city or a nation or globally. So I think those are all get into the fabric of how we are going to define democratization. So I think making it accessible and open available is a great place to start, but I think it's not going to solve the problem of like, is it really accessible in different contexts?
Yeah, great call outs. And I know that, when we see a broader access, and we talked about this a little bit in previous panels, like, the internet being one example, but when you see broader access to some technologies, there's obviously a lot of constraints and concerns to weigh in on. And so when we talk about democratizing AI, I guess, what are some of and especially maintaining transparency and accountability, what are some of the things we should be thinking about in this context? And feel free, maybe Robin, if you want to kick us off on this one.
Yeah, I think, again, maybe I'll use ChatGPT as a first example, right? So when ChatGPT first released, we saw Samsung employees put, essentially a corporate strategy up into the system. It wasn't that they were trying to be malicious or do something that they weren't supposed to do. They just didn't know any better. And so I think for lots of organizations right now, it's just struggling. What is the right uses that we want to allow these technologies to be? And how do we make sure that we're building it in a way that's open, but also protects our intellectual property, right? And sets the right boundaries and guardrails in place. And so I think there's almost every organization that I talk to is really balancing that pace of innovation and how do they innovate built on these great technologies that are moving faster than they've ever seen before, and how do they balance the risk and the exposure of risk that it opens up for their organization. And so I think for most organizations, they are in this state of how do we define those two things, and how do we create tools and systems and platforms and technologies that allow us to balance them in the right way while educating the people across our organization, like Fatma responded to earlier, because not everybody has the same educational background. So not everybody understands sort of what that means when they think about how to use these new technologies. But I'm sure, Sunil, you've probably seen this, right, in the course of your career as you've moved from, these different technologies in this evolution. I love to say, right, I remember starting at Microsoft and the vision and mission was like a PC on every desktop. Yet if I ask my children what that means, they have no idea because they don't even know what a PC is, right? And so, you know, not that we're the oldest on here, but I would love your perspective as you've seen that evolution of tech. Are you seeing similar?
I think you raised some great points, and I liked your reference to the context not just being about the country and region, but also the organization. And I think well, first of all, we're talking about a technology, right? The technology needs to be productized, and then it needs to get distributed. And the idea of just because this is possibly because of the potential for AI to democratize this, especially in the context of open science, you can't ignore the fact that these new inventions exist within systems and organizations and cultures that don't move as quickly. They don't move as fast. And so there's a lot of barriers to that. And whether it be in the policy world, whether it be in the corporate world or even the academic world, there's a lot of competition among groups to get that airtime and get recognition and get things. And ego and culture is important, or is a factor in many of these things. And I'd love to hear Fatma's view on this, but I read a fascinating article in The Economist in August. Maybe I could put it in the link here sometime, or share it with the broader audience, about how AI scientists are learning about how the human brain works to help inform how they build these neural networks. And Jeffrey Hinton is obviously, if you don't know, they call him the godfather of AI. He's published a lot of paper on this stuff, and they're looking at how the brain learns. One of the concepts was like this thing called back propagation error algorithm, understand like how brains, when they learn from a mistake, how do they learn? And so he created this whole paper about this stuff too. But that wasn't the fascinating part. What's fascinating part of the article was that after he published it, Francis Crick, who is a Nobel laureate in DNA and one of the founders of the human DNA and genome structure, took a whole takedown of that paper in Nature. And it just thought to me, like, why wouldn't these guys collaborate and talk before they have to publish it in public and argue this stuff? And it made me think, well, maybe AI scientists and neuroscientists don't really talk to one another. Then why not? Now, that's just an education area. You can imagine the corporate area, there's different siloed groups who feel threatened by their own positions and stuff, because most people they view the negative potential worry and consequences of new technology. They don't know about them, the potential benefits and the actual opportunity. So this reminds me that there are these new things that we discover, these new things that have this potential, are often stymied by just traditional things that not as easy to change. Changing a culture of a company, changing the organization of a company, or the university, or even an agency is very difficult. It's very difficult, and I think that's where you see a lot of it. If you're able to kind of break down some of these barriers and have greater collaboration that's enabled by AI, then you can see more of that opportunity, more of that potential realized. So I'd love to hear the other panelists' thoughts on that.
Yeah, just to add to that, what you have just said, Sunil, I think in terms of that greater collaboration, open science and open source work that we do in this space is going to be, or it already is, I think, is very critical and important. If I define accountability in like the most simplistic terms, I will say like it will require some systems and processes that anybody can scrutinize and validate, like going back to that more scientific problem of reproducibility. I think same thing applies to the models that we use today, the data sets that are being crafted and curated to train these models as well. So the same idea, if we have all these systems and processes open, not only just open sourcing the model weights, but also the data that is trained on, I think we are going to achieve a wider benefit of these practices that we do in the AI space.
I think it's interesting though, because it's changing over time. I think when we first saw it come out, everybody thought, oh, we're going to build large language models for everything, right? Or we're going to be able to leverage these proprietary models. But I mean, what we're actually seeing across, or what I'm seeing across the market is, and then it became, everybody had to be a prompt engineer, right? And they were going to make millions of dollars and everybody had to figure out how to do that. And now RAG's going to solve everything. I just think this space is moving so quickly that when you think about open and how to actually create these open ecosystems, there has to be some level of portability and exchangeability, because tech is moving faster than you're going to be able to build for today. And so when you think about, yes, there will be some use cases I'm seeing across an organization where an open or where a proprietary model is the right solution, where you need to know all the lyrics to every Beatles song that was ever written, in the history of mankind. Those types of things, it doesn't make sense for you to rebuild. But there are lots of organizations that are saying, okay, now how do we now scope down the use case and build more compound AI systems, which are sort of addressing what do we use the proprietary model for, and how do we make sure our open models, so that we have the EU AI Act requirements if we're doing business in Europe, or whatever the executive order will look like post-January in the US. How do we really think about making sure that we have full end-to-end lineage, explainability, and transparency across the entire ecosystem? And if we can say we use the proprietary models for this part of our solution, and then we've built our own small language models using these open AI models on top of, and here's the weights and here's the data sets that we used, and we can mitigate some of the biases that exist. Because I will, Sunil, not to put you on the point, but we all know that there's some level of gender bias in historic data, et cetera. I just read this whole article this morning about the poor Department of Welfare and Pensions in the UK is now being held accountable because fraud cases by being triggered by AI are more likely to hit certain age groups than others. So there are inherent biases in the data that we are building these AI solutions on top of. And so how do we really make sure that, if you think about how do we mitigate the impact that's going to have on society as we go forward, it has to be explainable, it has to be transparent. You have to be able to track that full end-to-end lineage and say, what data sets do we use? How do we mitigate some of the biases in those existing data sets? And then where did we use different levels of open versus proprietary components across the system? You're going to have to be able to explain all of that for the regulators, for the legislators.
Yeah, great points, Robin, and you're absolutely right. I am very aware of my own self-conscious bias, so that's the reason why I joined Women in Data, so they could teach me where I'm wrong. But so that's a good. But not everyone takes my approach to learning, so it is sometimes important to call it out, and sometimes people don't even understand that's operating on them, and that's a very thing to do. But it seems like what you're saying, which makes sense to me, is that this is as much requires us to rethink our business processes, our organizational structure, our workflows, and those are all incredibly boring topics we don't have to get into here, but these are just difficult and boring topics, and people have their territorial or concerns and their own power structures within companies that exist, and everyone's organized differently. So I think we have to also think about that as to how do we address that? How do we incentivize them to do the increased collaboration, not expect the technology in and of itself to do it by some miraculous thing? I think you can't ignore that. Again, if you could define that as culture, you define it as tradition or history, but to the extent some companies are regulated, they have a whole different way in which they bring products to market. The agencies that oversee their industry have a huge influence on how these products are bring to market, how they're marketed, and how the data is kept and stored. So these are all things that I think are worthwhile the conversation. I will say that the regards to how do the regulators address these issues, having been a former regulator, now working in private industry, I've noticed a few things that can perhaps address that. I'd often recommend to my clients from a playbook is that there's often there's often so many intermediaries between people who write the code and people who write the law. So you even use a lot lost in translation during that process. But bringing those people closer together, or even in the same room, does not necessarily address the problem, because then you have another issue, which is that people who write the code, they pray to the god of first principles, which I describe it, whereas the government regulators, they worship on the altar of precedent and history and analogy. Very contradictory religions. So you have to be able to understand that, to be able to communicate in a language, in a format that doesn't that they each understand each other, not speak past one another. So those are two concepts I've I've noticed into how to bridge that gap in terms of understanding and concerns.
Yeah, and I want to call out, I think, Robin, that was a really good point about just thinking about and Fatma as well, about reproducibility and accountability in this context. and bringing it to the data as well. So that's a great segue into talking about, half of the work, or, the old saying was like 80% was just like data engineering to get to the 20% of modeling, right? And, we're seeing, to your point, Robin, this like pace of innovation, and that time from research to like production implementation is faster than ever. I mean, this week is also NeurIPS, one of the most prestigious AI conferences out there, and half of the papers that are being presented are already like in some production environment, right? And that goes to show like the amount of data, like certain people have access to high quality data sets and things like this, and there's also open data sets. So given that, like, talk to me, tell us more about sort of like the role of data and how do we build kind of technical rigor and ethical guidelines around the data that's actually being used for models. I know this is obviously a meaty subject, but I'll open the floor to that.
I'll let Fatma tell you in practitioner, but maybe let me tell you from the flat platform perspective. I mean, from a Databricks perspective, this is absolutely why we think that AI and data can't be separate ecosystems, right? They have to exist in the same platform. They have to exist with the same governance and access controls on top of it. You have to have that lineage that can actually trace it from data to date, right, to the models, to the actual data products and services that you're providing. The minute you start to separate those into a separate technical platform, you are creating separate silos where you're trying to now replicate that data across the different ecosystems. So from a technical platform perspective, I think we are of the mind that you have to have the capability to leverage open ecosystems in the same platform as you do your existing legacy data ecosystems, as well as your future capabilities, whatever we don't even know that's still coming. And how do we make sure that you have that end-to-end governance, the end-to-end lineage? You will not have explainability if you haven't, right, if those pieces are not existing in the same platform. At least that you're right, that's sort of how we see the world. But I know, Fatma, you have done this in practice, so maybe I would love your perspective on it as well.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. I think hopefully I can make some useful comments in here. So the way that I have been doing it in my current and previous roles as well, definitely having a system for data governance so that you can trace that lineage of the data, where it is coming from, where it is going to, and also very clear and pointed out documentation for the use of the data, any kind of data that you're using. And especially now that I'm, as I mentioned, working in a very highly regulated environment. So we have a lot of extra rules that we can follow, and which dictates what we can use and what we can't, what cannot use, and what we can do with the data that we have. So that requires some custom systems that we have started building up for audits. So we're auditing our own data usage and how it informs the models and what it is actually allowing us to gain in terms of insights and decisions and things like that, and how and trying to decide how far we can actually use these systems and smart AI systems in what we're trying to do. And a big part of it, I think, this applies to any kind of industry, especially those that are highly regulated, is the privacy protections and mitigating any kind of bias that might seep into your data set. And for there are some I think useful and relatively better methods that are out there today that the research is going on. It's a very active research area that you can look into. As someone like me, I'm not a researcher, but I follow the research very closely, and I'm coming from a research background, and see how we can actually apply those systems. And the data governance system that we are trying to build has to be very robust. We really do not have any other options. So that requires a lot of experimentations and uses of different techniques to see which one is going to benefit better. And this also helps us to actually measure how, if there's a new model, for example, or a new system for privacy preserving techniques and things like that, to experiment with them and evaluate them to see how it is going to impact our case. And I'm sure this is different for different domains and different industries, but it comes down to really having that solid system of data governance integrated into every aspect of the system where you're using AI or data or any kind of model for that.
I'm curious, Robin, you made the point earlier about data and AI systems having to be the same platform or same infrastructure. It seems almost obvious or intuitive. I'm curious from your work, what are the objections to that, or what are the concerns for that, or are there any?
Not necessarily the same infrastructure, right? Like I don't know. I mean, I've been in this space, for 2 decades, and I remember when we first came out with cloud, and every organization was like, "We're just going to move everything to the cloud. It's so much cheaper, right? It'll be faster. We have scalability, all of those things." Problem is, rising energy costs made it seem okay. It's not as smart as we thought to move all of our on-prem data centers to the cloud. So I think for infrastructure, I think we will continue to see organizations decide where do they want data stored on-prem, where do they want it in the cloud, what are the right use cases and models that they're trying to apply this data to that would require the underlying infrastructure or storage and where that needs to be stored. The actual platform itself and how do you bridge the gap between it? I mean, this is the reason Databricks was founded, I think, was because organizations were managing these entire separate ecosystems. You had your data warehouse for your structured data, and then we thought data lakes were going to solve everything. So let's throw all of our unstructured into data lakes, and then people started calling them data swamps because they had no idea what existed in there, what data actually where data resided. And that's probably one of the biggest issues I still see across every organization is what they call silos, right? They have all these silos of data that have grown up over the course of the organization's history. I remember the first time I tried to consolidate at Microsoft and everybody started downloading customer data to access databases under their desks, right? Like there are still organizations operating on Access and Excel spreadsheets that just have all these data silos. And so how we really think about it is, look, you're going to have some level of distributed data by infrastructure, right? And where it lives and where it exists. You're not necessarily going to want to copy that data back and forth so that the data scientists have access to all of the data they need, or your data analysts have access to all of the BI that they want to be able to deliver and all the data assets they need to be able to deliver that. So how do you create almost this translation layer on top, which was right, the Delta Lake open source project was to solve for that problem. How do we allow data to live in whatever infrastructure, but operate with this translation layer that allows you to run AI and BI across the same data sets, leveraging the Spark engine, right, which is essentially where our founders came from. We're the creators of Spark. And so, we have been grounded in sort of how do we create these open source technologies that help bridge the gap and break down these silos. And then, about 5 years ago, there really was this focus on governance because every organization was really trying to create a single access control layer that would allow them to monitor and regulate and create the right access controls on top of all of those data sets without having to create them across one for my warehouse, one for my lake, one for my AI systems, et cetera. And so that has always sort of been our vision, is where can we aggregate so that regardless of where the infrastructure is or regardless of where the data lies, can you have a single platform that gives you that end-to-end lineage, the end-to-end governance, the capability to run AI or BI, regardless of where the data is being stored? That's my Databricks pitch. So I think I get at least one bonus point for that one. Let's throw them in there.
Yeah, you can have a few bonus points. All of you can. I'll give them a few. And so given your all's different experiences, I'm really curious sort of and especially for some members in the audience that, are data practitioners, but maybe aren't as engaged in AI specific efforts and sort of like democratizing AI and some of the challenges associated to that. What are some of the I guess data concerns there's a lot of, I guess, copyright privacy, especially in regulated industries, issues popping up, right? Given some of these advances. Are there new concerns? Are these concerns that have always been around? Or like, how do we think about it differently as open data and AI evolve? And maybe Fatma, if you want to kick us off, I'd love to hear, especially given your compliance and regulated industry background. Like, are there new things to think about?
I think some of the problems that we have been discussing and talking about and trying to solve maybe over a decade, maybe even longer, some of them are still around, definitely, because we are still using models that have been trained on biased data. and it's still hard to detect all the bias that you can have and how it applies to different domains and areas that you're using the data for. And although we have some maybe more recent and maybe effective techniques like federated learning and privacy preserving techniques, that some of the more advanced ones that we have been using recently. But I think the problem still exists, and we need to be very actively tackle that as much as we can. And part of it is some of the things that we have already talked about, putting different responsible AI steps in the different stages of the process that you're using the data for. But yeah, that's how I will get started.
Any other thoughts on sort of the evolution of open data and sort of like new challenges that we're facing in the context of AI? Yeah.
It seems to me that there are just, again, I'm a little speaking out of my area of knowledge here, but they're often the same problems, but they're just further exacerbated by the extent of it, the degree of it. And so, in the time to respond to it, right? So copyright issues, trademark issues, all these things. Even like you mentioned earlier, Robin, about how companies were uploading, Samsung or whatever companies are uploading their strategy docs into the thing. Now that's not training the model. Or does it train the model? Or what does that do to the model? And then all of a sudden, you can have another company, a competitive company access or benefit from that training. So it's part of it. It's hard to understand what this does, how this thing works in some capacity, and how people are using it. And I do think, how we're using, even now, I'm still figuring out how to use AI. And it's funny you mentioned that was your was it your grandmother or your mother, Robin? But yeah, I'm like, I can ask the same question. I really don't know. I use like a supercharged Google search, but it's much, much more than that. I don't know if any of you've played around with Notebook ML, but it's fascinating. I almost upload. It's a product released by Google that allows to great kind of dissemination, summaries and analysis of PDFs and academic, but you can do whatever PDFs you want. And they also actually create a function that you can have a podcast created from your document, which is pretty remarkable. If you haven't played around with it, I encourage everyone to do it. I'm not sure if it's free or not, but in any event, it's worth
free.
it. Is it okay? Yeah, it's definitely worth it. It's just incredible to know that this is, if I write about AI, I'm in the business. I'm clearly speaking about it here, and I still realize how little I know how to use this tech and this innovation in a way that's is breathtaking and scary, right? It's like it's very, if we don't get some of these foundational principles right, it could just make things that exist today that we want to fix worse and harder to fix. In intellectual property, and all that encompasses is one of the areas that I think it will take some time to root out, because ultimately the courts take a while. So these things are going to be, they're going to be case law around it. But in the meantime, as a business person, in an organization, or even in an academic, how do we do it in a way that has a lot of integrity, doesn't compromise our values, and doesn't affect our business or our professorship and just our writing. So it's I guess a long way of me saying I don't know, but I'm just bringing up these are, I think, old problems, but just the degree and extent of it are much higher.
I think the other thing is making sure that what I always love to tell organizations, look, technology is like 10% of it. 90% of it is your people and process. Like, how are you actually setting up the organization for success? So yes, some of the problems are absolutely inherent based on the systems and where they've come from and the legacy that we're bringing along on sort of this technical evolution and journey that we're going on. But we are introducing a new level of sort of complexity into the ecosystem. Is that, I think, Sunil, you referred to this earlier. Look, digital transformation has been talked around for a long time, and people felt like it was a singular project for an organization, and that there was some finite amount of time, and then we could throw our hands up and say we have achieved digital nirvana and success across the organization. I mean, I spent 15 years at Microsoft working on that. I have yet to see any organization do it end to end and say that they are completely successful and where they want to be, and that they can keep up with the pace of innovation at what it's at today. And so I think the new problems that are being introduced are, how do you create these cultures of constant change for an organization? Because people don't like to change. And so where can we use tech to block some of the complexities and the change? For example, I don't think a finance end user cares what model you're using on the back end, right? And so how do we make sure that we block some of that from them so that we can interchange as a new model comes out that's better, that's more effective, et cetera? How do we allow tech to do that on the back end? But how do we create an organization where people want to do this? I remember when we were going to early panels on AI and somebody threw up a screen that was just a black screen and they said that, right, Skynet is coming, the world's going to end, everybody run in fear. Right. I think we now, a year into it, realize that it's not the end of the world, but it's not complete nirvana either, where everybody can just throw up their hands and do nothing anymore because AI is going to do everything for us. And so I think it is this whole culture of how do we get people more comfortable with change and being able to go on this sort of transformational journey. And that's what I think is the new and novel part to it, is that we used to treat it like a single transformation, a single tool, a single platform, a single technology, and a single model, single data set, sort of in this singular. And now it's compound, complex systems. And so how do we create a organizational ecosystem for companies that allow them to be complex compound ecosystems in a constant change of stage and change and evolution? And that will be my book, Sunil. So
maybe there's a collaboration here waiting to happen. But I would hope so. I love that perspective that you're right. It is AI itself is becoming a more and more complex system, and then a chain of different AIs, right? And so you can see this being a challenge in that way. I guess, Robin, you touched on one thing, which is, driving a culture of change and like being able to make people comfortable or help people be comfortable with this. Maybe that's a good segue into sort of like some of the best practices or things that you're seeing that are actually helping people to, of course, do whatever it is they need to do and drive business, but do that using responsible AI. And so I'd love to hear from all of you, like, what are you seeing, any best practices or tools or collaborations that really promote the responsible to counter that sort of like Skynet, this AGI doom and gloom narrative? So I'd love to hear from all of you about that.
I guess I can get us started. Some of the practices that I also utilize and I see that they're promising are, we started with model cards, where we explain some of the metadata about a specific model. And then we segued into data cards, and that will be information about the data sets that we use, especially the public ones. And you can see these in Hugging Face, which is one of the platforms where you can have free public data sets. And I believe the research was originally, or the model was originally kind of defined by Google research, if I'm not wrong. But I think dataset cards, where you can input a lot of the metadata that will inform your future transformations of that data or use of data and implications and limitations of that specific data that you use, has been very useful in my experience. And that's just one example. There are also some toolkits out there that are available. I believe Microsoft has one, IBM has one that anybody can use, and they are to a certain degree effective as well. But however, I found in my experience that depending on the domain and area that you use and the data set that you have, that toolkit sometimes might fall short and become a little bit too general. But there are also use cases that they have been useful in terms of detecting some of the biases and things like that. But those are the two that I can think of in terms of best practices and tools that are available right now.
I can't speak to tools per se. I could more speak maybe perhaps or organizational structure, about how to create incentives within the organization so people to act in a way that's more holistic and think about things that are maybe they normally don't think about. Is I was in a panel. I wasn't in the panel. I was hearing a panel about AI in healthcare at a very popular conference. I won't name names at this point. It was a great conference and great panel. And one of the questions from the audience was like, how does this affect CMS? And none of the panelists even knew what CMS stood for. CMS is the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services in this country that has almost responsible 25% of the overall healthcare spend. If you're building an AI product in healthcare, it probably should make sense for you to even know what that acronym stands for. And the point is, why don't they? Because usually the product org is very separate from the policy org, and they only interact when they have to. So what if you create incentives where the policy, requirements are embedded into your product org, such that your bonus, your actual, when you release products is more, instead of taking a 1-hour class a week with policy folks, you actually impart your own, way in which you're rewarded. So that level of kind of insights is something that needs to be thought about, is how do you create that incentives so that these kind of sharing and collaboration works at the product development stage, not when it's about to be released, and make sure that it's in compliance with existing rules and regulations. Those things that you could replicate across the board. And one of the great examples of doing that was I think it's called Digital Citizen, the name of the book. It talked about a case study about Alipay. And this is before the CCP had different, sites for their own technology leaders. But Alipay was on its way to almost global dominance in AI and financial services, the way they're going about it. And what was interesting is not their ambition, but how they went about organizing their company. So if you were building a product for the domestic market, you needed to take a minor in the international market. If your main language was Mandarin, you need to understand English. So this was like requirements for your job and requirements for how you were compensated. It was a way in which it kind of broke through. Like if you think about how most companies today, if you look at the different org structures, how they interact with one another, it's very perfunctory, and it's probably built on outdated assumptions and outdated systems. So rethinking how you build that incentive structure within the organization perhaps will maybe lead to more the results we're talking about on this panel.
I think what I've seen for organizations that are doing this really well, it really is sort of driving clarity across the organization. And that means having, end-to-end communication plans, because people will do things because they don't know either that something else is already being done, or they're just not aware of it, right? And so how do you make sure that everybody inside your organization knows what the vision is for the organization when it comes to AI, so that they don't start building their own things or doing their own things that will be misaligned by policy, by right, by the responsible, with the moral ethics of the organization, all of those things. I think we kind of presume that people know them as part of the organization, but they don't. It's a constant reiteration of re-clarifying what that is and what does the impact of that mean. And so, as we roll out a new tool, a new system, a new model, et cetera, how do we make sure that people are really, really clear on what does that mean and how it's going to translate into the mission and vision that we're working toward as an organization? And ultimately, it should translate into things like transparency and explainability and all of those other requirements that are necessary for responsible AI usage.
Yeah, and I to piggyback off of that, a charter can go a long way. Actually, I think one of the communities I've seen that's super impressive about just being upfront about that kind of mission is actually the Rust communities. That they have inclusion like right up front, and they talk about technical implementations that they promote, similar to what Fatma was talking about, right? Like specific things that they incorporate, and that's part of their charter. But in tactical terms, I guess, so what are some of those examples? So Robin, you mentioned like you are seeing some organizations do this well or like promote this well. What are some examples that you all are seeing, whether it's your own industry or others, where you're seeing kind of both a responsible AI, but also sort of democratized AI driving positive change or kind of progress?
I guess there are two examples I've read recently about. I can't claim any subject matter knowledge in, but I think our early stage is very promising. One is using open data in genomic research for personalized medicine. That was one area that I thought was really fascinating. The other one would be using open AI models to predict climate changes, suggesting policy decisions in global warming issues. So ultimately, this tool is so amazing in so many aspects, right? But of course, all this, then you get to the point of is the data they're relying on, the foundational data biased based on some kind of everything is biased. It's just a matter of whether we know what the biases are, right? So that's more of it than anything else. The idea of an unbiased system is unrealistic. And it's just like you just want to know every author, every institution, every company has its bias, some good, some bad. And so I think us understanding what those biases are, but then able to then accelerate that collaboration and bringing some insights into these data sets are very promising. But I personally can't necessarily speak to either climate change or personal medicine. But I'm bringing that as examples. You mentioned, Michelle, of what looks like areas that that would have taken much longer to achieve, but they seem much more, in the near term than far term today.
Maybe I'll take a more commercial approach that has an ESG sort of impact. So I think up on the Databricks website, you can read all about JetBlue. I think they have done some phenomenal things around AI, like really innovating very, very quickly to do things like, how do you bring together weather plus aircraft maintenance plus pilot and steward, airline steward sort of capacity and capability. So when because I travel hundreds of thousands of miles every year, I really appreciate that if my flight gets canceled, you can automatically rebook me, as opposed to me having to stand in line at SeaTac Airport, right, and wait to get realigned. But they're solving things like, how do we do things like aircraft maintenance that minimize the carbon footprint? How do we make sure that we're sort of creating these ecosystems and end-to-end supply chain that help us have an impact on those things? So while there's a commercial aspect to it, I absolutely think there are organizations that are also leveraging it to solve some of the bigger societal things. Maybe with that, I'll give one other example. This was from my time back at Microsoft, just the power of data, and I think AI built on top of that data. So one of the AI for good winners was Ocean Mind in 2022 or 2021. Apologize for the misquote on the year. I'm not exactly sure. But essentially, they were trying to leverage data and AI to solve for sustainable fishing, right? And just phenomenal progress that they made in that space. But I thought what was more interesting is that based on that data, they were able to also track and determine human trafficking. So this is where I think the true power of data and AI comes in, is that we don't even know the problems that we can solve until you start to solve some of the problems that are in front of you. And so I just think that you're right, the opportunity in front of us is so amazing. The technology now has given people the capability to solve some of these really complicated problems that we haven't been able to do before. And so we don't even know what is the next level or the next generation of things that we're going to be able to solve for, because we can, and that we have the power to. And how do you do that in a responsible and ethical way? And then what impact does it have on society and ethical and responsibility? Being members of society together, I think, is also another impact to it.
And I think one example that I can give, it's not necessarily a case study, but more like a general application area, is more recently we have started talking about AI agents, like these AI systems that can actually not only predict or bring data or information to us, but also execute those tasks. And one very, I think, interesting and exciting application was there has been a couple of papers very recently. One of them introduced the AI scientist. This is like an AI agent that actually can do novel science, can create some novel knowledge in scientific domains. And of course, it's not perfect, and it has some issues, and it has some controversial debates around it. However, I think the promise of having an AI system coming up with novel solutions to the problems that we have been trying to solve is, I think, very exciting to me, at least. And that application, I know that, there has, after that first paper, there has been quite a few of others as well. And it's exciting to everybody, including scientists and practitioners and people who use it in application as well. And the other one is, I want to point out, is the platform of Hugging Face. They have a lot of open source resources that scientists and practitioners of AI can freely use. And that enabled a lot of the research, both in academia and industry as well. Although some of them are small scale, but still, I think it's a great example of being able to enable others to do science and solve problems using AI by providing them all these resources.
Yeah, I love that. Using AI to help us think about what the potential applications of AI are. That's great. Your AI scientist example, Fatma.
Right.
So
I think want everyone to read that paper.
Yeah, I haven't read it yet either, but it's just a funny kind of inception concept.
Honestly, first, I just want AI to help me figure out what to do with my 5-year-old daughter on Saturday. That's all.
That may be the hardest problem to solve.
This is a personalized medicine, climate. Those are great, but let's figure out what we're doing on Saturday. That'd be let's start with that, and then we can go from there. Is what my think is. You got to take baby steps, right? So.
Absolutely.
If anyone has any tools to help with that, with AI, let me know, because
put it in the chat.
Unstructured data problem, what to do with the kids in the weekend. So if you have some ideas on that, I'm all ears.
Absolutely. And just out of curiosity, one follow-up question for Robin. I'm just curious, do you recall what the team sort of looked like for the Ocean Mind use case? Like what kind of roles might have been involved to develop that?
I'm not sure. They have a whole published paper up on the Microsoft website, but I think it's more about the solution and less about the how they actually delivered it. But I don't recall. Sorry, it's been a few years since I read.
No, it's good, because so this might be homework for all of us, because I would suspect that there were technologists and lots of diverse types of roles involved to solve such a problem. So I know we're going to start wrapping up the panel conversation. It's been amazing. Maybe if just to conclude, I'd love to hear a quick round robin of sort of your one thing you're very personally excited about regarding AI, and especially as it becomes more open to people. So maybe Fatma, do you want to start us off? What's one thing that you're the most excited about?
I am excited about AI agents. I have been experimenting and following the area very closely recently, and I think the potential is super exciting.
I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, I would second that. More specifically, you can imagine AI agents being able to read information that comes out on a weekly or daily basis and bringing you information that's relevant to you based on what it knows about yourself and what you're trying to accomplish, whether it be a personal goal of running a marathon, or it could be a career goal of, achieving a certain deal closure. So I think this could even a health goal of losing weight, whatever it is. I think now, before we have all these tools before today, but oftentimes all this it requires a lot of onus on the user to connect the dots and make it actionable for us. I think the beauty of what this current innovation allows for is making it simpler for us to act on those insights, and in some cases act for us, and make it so it becomes more friendly. Technology, it becomes more friendly in a way that all the terminology we've said in this panel is invisible to most people. Even in the corporate world, they're not going to really spend the time to learn about this stuff if they're more worried about certain key goals and objectives that their group needs to achieve. They're not going to get into the details of how the LLM's been architected. So I think that to me is I think going to be very fascinating, empowering people, because we have so much information out there, so much details. It's hard to know where to begin and what to read, and we don't have the time to do it. I think the ability for AI agents to decipher what's important to us based on what it knows about us is that personalization element is at a level now that's never been done before. This could be very exciting.
And
I think what I'm looking forward to, is the agentic plus the personalization. And by automating the things that I don't want to do anymore, what are all the amazing things that people are going to be able to solve now that you just haven't had time to do? And so I think for me, that's what's exciting, is feel like every customer I work with, every client I talk to, every panel I participate in, I hear about these phenomenal use cases that are just on the precipice. And I think we're now to the point where we're going to make a difference and an impact in a positive way, leveraging responsible AI for our children and the generations to come that we haven't necessarily been able to do before. And so I think that's what I'm looking forward to the most.
Well, what I'm really looking forward to, Michelle, is I'll have next year my agent representing me in this panel, so I don't have to. So it's we're going to get to that state, and when that happens, it's frees up more time for me. So that's all good.
Well, now I can just make agents of all of you using open models, which is also terrifying. So, but on a positive note, thank you so much for all of your insights today. It's been such a pleasure hosting all of you coming from such different backgrounds and talking about, how we're going to be able to increase the access to different AI use cases and models, and to do that responsibly. So thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Yeah.